history lovers, and the perpetually curious. When you hear Middle Ages, what's the first image that gallops into your mind? Knights in slightly too shiny armor? Towering, drafty castles? Or maybe the infamous chastity belt? Seriously, were these things standard issue? Or did everyone just agree to look really, really serious in their portraits while secretly having a wild time in the haylofts? The truth about sex and intimacy back then? Well, it's a bit like trying to assemble flat-pack furniture from 1,000 years ago. Confusing, often contradictory, and definitely not as straightforward as the instruction manual, if one even existed, might suggest. Today, we're yanking back the heavy tapestry, or more likely, a somewhat scratchy woolen blanket, to peek into one of history's most misunderstood and, let's be honest, juiciest topics: what sex and intimacy were really like in the Middle Ages. We're aiming to sift through the myths, the legends, and the downright bizarre ideas to get to something resembling the historical reality. And trust me, it's a period spanning roughly a millennium, so it's got more plot twists than a medieval soap opera. So what's on the agenda for our historical deep dive? We'll be dissecting the colossal influence of the church, you know, the original thou shalt, and thou shalt absolutely not, especially not that way, organization. We'll investigate medieval marriage, which often had less to do with butterflies and more to do with cows and land. We'll explore the world of medieval romance, which could be surprisingly steamy, and figure out what everyday folks actually got up to, or didn't get up to, when the lights, or rather the single sputtering candle, went out. So, grab your preferred beverage. Mead, perhaps, if you're feeling thematic. Get comfy, and let's journey back to a time that was far more complex and human than you might think. This is going to be enlightening, occasionally eyebrow-raising, and definitely not your grandma's history lesson, unless your grandma is super cool. So to understand sex in the Middle Ages, you first have to understand who was laying down the law, and boy did they have a lot of laws. The undisputed heavyweight champion of moral regulation, the Church, capital C. And their views on sex? Well, let's just say they weren't exactly handing out gold stars for enthusiastic participation. It all kicks off with a classic story. Adam, Eve, a chatty snake, and an apple that apparently came with a very, very long list of unfortunate side effects. This original sin business cast a long shadow, and sex got tangled up in it right from the get-go. It was seen as the primary way this sin was passed down through generations. And then there's lust, one of the top 7 on the definitely don't do these list, the 7 deadly sins. So sex, inherently, was seen as a bit problematic. A necessary evil at best, something to be approached with caution, a bit like assembling that flat-pack furniture we mentioned earlier. You have to do it, but you suspect it might fall apart at any moment. Thinkers like St. Augustine and later St. Thomas Aquinas were the intellectual architects of this framework. For Augustine, who, let's be fair, had a bit of a wild youth himself before he saw the light, the ideal was complete celibacy. But recognizing that humanity needed to, continue existing, marriage was the grudgingly accepted container for any sexual activity. And even then, its only legitimate purpose was procreation. So if sex was only for baby-making within marriage, how did that work in practice? That is where the concept of the debitum conjugale, the marital debt, came in. Rolls right off the tongue, doesn't it? Sounds more like a tax form than a romantic evening. Essentially, spouses owed each other sex. Not for fun, mind you, but to produce little future taxpayers and churchgoers. And, importantly, to stop each other from being tempted to sin elsewhere. It was like a preventative measure, a sort of sexual fire extinguisher for lustful thoughts. And how was this debt to be, paid? Well, the church had strong opinions on that too. The accepted, nay, often only sanctioned position was what we now call the missionary position. Man on top, face to face. Why? Because it was deemed the most natural for conception, and crucially, the least likely to lead to excessive pleasure. Any deviation, woman on top, from behind, standing up using a trapeze, okay, maybe not the trapeze, they weren't that inventive, was often condemned as unnatural, bestial, or just plain sinful. The theological gymnastics required to justify this must have been quite something. But wait, there's more. Even within marriage, with the approved position and procreative intent, there was a whole calendar of no-go days. Think of it as the original Sorry Honey Not Tonight, but with divine backing. Sex was forbidden on Sundays, on major feast days, and there were a lot of those. During Lent, during Advent, when a woman was menstruating, during pregnancy, and for a good while after childbirth. Add it all up, and some scholars estimate that couples might have been looking at over a third of the year, sometimes even half, where sex was off the table. And if you did stray from these rules, or engage in acts deemed, shall we say, non-procreative, that's where the penitentials come in. These were basically handbooks for priests, listing every conceivable and some inconceivable sexual sin and its corresponding penance. We're talking detailed lists, things like oral sex, anal sex, masturbation for men and women, homosexual acts, bestiality, even certain types of kissing if it was deemed too passionate. The penances could range from fasting on bread and water for a few days to years of prayer, or even undertaking a long, arduous pilgrimage. It's like the medieval version of a spiritual parking ticket, but way more intense and with fewer appeal options. You really had to want to avoid that eternal damnation. Now, it's crucial to say, this was the doctrine. This was the official line from the church, the ideal they were pushing. But as with any set of very strict rules, the question always is, how closely did ordinary people actually follow them? Did everyone meticulously consult their liturgical calendar before a bit of nookie? We'll be exploring that gap between sermon and reality as we go on, because human nature has a funny way of being human. So if the church was the strict parent laying down the rules for sex, then marriage was the officially sanctioned, heavily chaperoned playroom. But forget any fluffy Hollywood notions of riding off into the sunset with your soulmate. For most people in the Middle Ages, especially those with a bit of cash or a fancy title, marriage was less hearts and flowers and more assets and alliances. Think of it as a medieval business merger, but with more feasting and fewer PowerPoint presentations. The primary purpose of marriage, particularly for the nobility and the burgeoning merchant classes, was all about consolidating power, land, and wealth. Does your dad have a strategically important castle? Does my daughter come with a hefty bag of gold and a few hundred acres of prime sheep grazing land? Excellent. Let's make some heirs. Romantic love is the basis for marriage? That was a bit of a niche concept, often viewed with suspicion, like trying to pay your taxes with good intentions. Marriages were frequently arranged, sometimes when the happy couple were still in diapers, or at least barely out of them. The age of consent for marriage could be shockingly young by our standards, as low as 12 for girls and 14 for boys in some places, though consummation was often delayed. It was all about securing that lineage and making sure the family name and the family fortune continued. Dowries, the property or money a bride brought to her husband, and dower rights, what a widow was entitled to, were meticulously negotiated. It was less, do you take this woman, and more, do you accept these terms and conditions? Now here's a slightly surprising twist. The church, for all its strictness elsewhere, did technically insist that marriage required the free consent of both parties. You couldn't just be dragged to the altar kicking and screaming theoretically. In practice, of course, the family pressure, societal expectations, and the lack of viable alternatives for most women meant that free consent could be a pretty flexible term. Imagine your dad, the local baron, gently suggesting, you marry the son of his powerful, slightly terrifying ally. Your options for saying, nah, I'm good, were somewhat limited. And once the vows were exchanged, there was another crucial element: consummation. No consummation, no valid marriage in the eyes of the church. This could lead to some rather awkward and public situations if one party claimed the marriage hadn't been, shall we say, finalized. Impotence was a legitimate ground for annulment, and sometimes proof of potency or lack thereof involved rather embarrassing public examinations or even performance tests supervised by matrons or physicians. Imagine that for pressure on your wedding night. All right, Hubert, the whole village is waiting. No pressure. With all this talk of contracts and consummation, was there any room for actual affection? Could love blossom amidst the land deals and lineage anxieties? Absolutely. While marriage might not have started with romance, it didn't mean love couldn't grow. Think of it like an arranged marriage in a sitcom. Starts off awkward, but by season 3, they're genuinely into each other. We have letters, wills, and even household manuals like The Goodman of Paris, written by an elderly Parisian merchant for his young wife, that show genuine care, companionship, and affection between spouses. The goodman advises his wife on everything from running the household to pleasing him in various ways, but there's an undercurrent of concern for her well-being and happiness. It wasn't always the grand, sweeping passion of Lancelot and Guinevere. That kind of high-drama love was usually reserved for illicit affairs outside marriage, which we'll get to. But a quiet, steady, comfortable love? That was definitely achievable. And, For many, the bedrock of a stable life. What if it really didn't work out? Well, divorce, as we understand it, a legal dissolution of a valid marriage, simply didn't exist. The church taught that a true marriage was indissoluble, what God has joined together, let no man put asunder, and all that. However, there was the option of an annulment. This wasn't ending a marriage, it was a declaration that a valid marriage had never existed in the first place. Grounds for annulment were tricky and often expensive to prove. Things like being too closely related, consanguinity, and the definition of too close changed over time, leading to some convenient loopholes for nobles wanting out. A pre-existing marriage contract, that pesky non-consummation or impotence, or if one party hadn't truly consented, though again, hard to prove. For most ordinary folk, if you made your marital bed, you were pretty much stuck lying in it, for better or for worse. Or, you could get a legal separation from bed and board, a mensa at thoro, meaning you lived apart but couldn't remarry. So marriage was a serious, lifelong commitment. For better or, quite often, this is my life now. Marriage was often a practical affair, a bit like a well-organized business partnership. But what about lerv? That tingly, heart-pounding, can't eat, can't sleep kind of feeling? Did medieval folks just suppress all that? Or did it find other, perhaps more creative outlets? Oh, you bet it did. Welcome to the often dramatic, sometimes downright dangerous, world of medieval love and desire beyond the wedding vows. Enters courtly love, the medieval equivalent of a blockbuster romantic drama, complete with its own set of bewildering rules. Emerging in the fancy courts of 12th century southern France, courtesy of those poetic rock stars, the troubadours, this wasn't your everyday let's get a mortgage together kind of love. This was idealized love, often for a noble lady who was, plot twist, usually already married, and frequently to someone else very important, like the knight's lord. Awkward. The knight would pledge undying devotion, perform heroic deeds in her name, write angsty poetry, and generally suffer beautifully from afar, or sometimes not so afar. It was all about chivalry, secret glances, tokens of affection, and a whole lot of longing. Think Lancelot in Guinevere or Tristan in Isolde, relationships that were passionate, legendary, and catastrophically adulterous. Historians still debate how much of this was a purely literary fantasy, a sort of elaborate game played by the aristocracy, versus something people actually tried to live out. Either way, it certainly gave them something to gossip about at those long, drafty castle dinners. And if you want a real peek into the medieval psyche when it came to love, lust, and everything in between, you absolutely have to dive into their literature. It wasn't all lofty ideals and pining knights. Authors like Chaucer, with his Canterbury Tales, or Boccaccio with the Decameron, weren't shy about depicting the full spectrum of human desire. Their stories are teeming with clever seductions, hilariously cuckolded husbands, randy monks, and women who knew exactly what they wanted and how to get it. And then there are the fablio. These were short, comic, and often delightfully obscene verse tales that were super popular, especially with the growing urban crowds. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of a raunchy stand-up routine or a naughty sitcom. They were all about earthly desires, bodily functions, and outsmarting the powerful or the pious, often involving priests behaving badly or wives tricking their dopey husbands to meet their lovers. These stories show a side of medieval life that was far less concerned with theological debates about sin and much more interested in a good laugh and, well, getting some. What all this tells us is that despite the church's best efforts to keep a tight rein on things, and despite the elaborate social codes of courtly love, basic human nature was, as ever, doing its thing. People fell in love, people experienced lust, people sought pleasure and connection, sometimes within the rules, and, as these stories delight in telling us, very often outside them. The medieval world wasn't just black and white, pious or sinful. It was a vibrant, messy, human tapestry of desires. We've talked about the rules, the romance, and the racy stories. But what about the actual act itself? What did medieval folks understand about their own bodies? Were they all fumbling in the dark? Or did they have some, shall we say, operating instructions? Well, their understanding of reproductive biology was, to put it mildly, a bit different from ours. Most of their science was inherited from ancient Greek thinkers like Galen and Aristotle, which meant it was a fascinating mix of astute observation and ideas that make us go, huh? For instance, They generally believed in the two-seed theory, that both the man and the woman produced a seed or emission, and both were necessary for conception. Some even thought the woman's seed was more like a fertile ground, while the man's was the active planter. Gardening metaphors, always a classic. This belief that female orgasm or emission played a role in conception is quite interesting, because it sometimes bumped up against the church's procreation only, no naughty pleasure stance. If female pleasure helped make babies, then surely it wasn't entirely sinful, right? The mental gymnastics were real. Medieval medical texts, when they weren't busy prescribing questionable concoctions of herbs and ground-up gemstones, did discuss things like aphrodisiacs. Having trouble in the chamber, Sir Knight? Try this powdered stag antler. And treatments for infertility or impotence. Some of it was pure superstition, but some might have had a grain of folk wisdom in there. Now, if sex was primarily for procreation according to the church, what if you didn't want another mouth to feed? Or if a pregnancy was, shall we say, inconveniently timed or socially problematic? Despite the thunderous condemnations from the pulpit, people in the Middle Ages definitely tried to control their fertility. And the church knew it, because they spent a lot of time telling people not to. Coitus interruptus, the withdrawal method, was probably the most common form of contraception, as old as coitus itself. But they also experimented with physical barriers, though probably not very effective ones. Amulets and charms, definitely not effective but worth a shot. And a whole host of herbal potions and pessaries. Some of these herbs, like rue or savin, did have properties that could induce menstruation or even abortion, but they were also incredibly dangerous and could easily poison the woman. Abortion, when attempted, was a desperate and risky measure, and like contraception, it was considered a grave sin, often equated with homicide. But the fact that these practices existed, and were frequently condemned, tells us that people were actively trying to navigate the consequences of sex, regardless of doctrine. Let's talk ambiance, or rather, the potential lack thereof. What about hygiene and privacy? Did medieval bedrooms resemble fragrant boudoirs, or something else? Bathing habits varied wildly. In the early Middle Ages, public bathhouses, a hangover from Roman times, were pretty common in towns and cities, and people bathed relatively frequently. Later on, concerns about morality, all that communal nudity, and disease, especially during plague times, led to many bathhouses being shut down. So, cleanliness was inconsistent. And privacy? That was a luxury most people couldn't afford. Poorer families often lived, ate, slept, and did everything else in a single room. Even in wealthier households, beds might be in semi-public spaces, and servants often slept in the same room as their masters, or just outside the door. The grand four-poster bed with curtains wasn't just for show. It was a practical way to get a tiny bit of seclusion and warmth. Imagine trying to have an intimate moment when your great aunt, 3 kids, and the dog are all snoozing a few feet away. It certainly adds a layer of complexity to things. Amidst all the rules, the rudimentary science, and the potentially crowded conditions, we have to ask, did people experience sexual pleasure? The answer is an emphatic medieval verily. While procreation was the official justification for sex within marriage, it's naive to think that pleasure wasn't a part of the experience. In fact, the church's constant, anxious warnings against seeking excessive pleasure even within marriage is pretty strong evidence that people were, indeed, enjoying themselves, perhaps a bit too much for the theologian's comfort. The sheer volume of bawdy literature, like those fablio we talked about, which positively revel in sexual escapades and witty seductions, also screams that pleasure was very much on people's minds. Humans then, as now, are wired for it. We've established the church had its rules, marriage had its purposes, and human nature was doing its thing. But what happened when doing its thing directly flouted those big, bold, capital letter sins? What were the consequences when people stepped, or rather, leapt with wild abandon, outside the sanctioned lines of medieval morality? Buckle up, because we're about to explore the transgressions and some surprising alternatives that existed in the shadows. Adultery, the ultimate marital betrayal, and a big no-no according to pretty much everyone in charge. The church condemned it fiercely, and society generally followed suit, though with a hefty dose of hypocrisy. If you got caught, the consequences could be severe, and surprise, surprise, often way harsher for women. For a woman, being found guilty of adultery could mean public humiliation. Think being paraded through the streets, maybe with her hair shorn, or being dunked in the local river on a cucking stool. In some, more extreme, law codes. It could even mean physical mutilation or death with serious business, designed to shame and deter. For men, well, let's just say there was often a bit more of a societal shrug, especially if their dalliance was with a woman of lower social status. A boys will be boys attitude, medieval style. The double standard was, shall we say, alive and probably wearing a very smug codpiece. Now, here's a real head-scratcher for medieval morality: prostitution. On the one hand, unequivocally sinful, a clear violation of church teachings. On the other hand, it was often tolerated, sometimes even regulated, by civic authorities in towns and cities. Why the contradiction? Well, some influential thinkers, like our old friend Thomas Aquinas, argued that prostitution was a necessary evil, a bit like a sewer. He rather uncharitably suggested, unpleasant, but it carries away the filth that might otherwise contaminate the whole city. The charming idea was that brothels provided an outlet for unstoppable male lust, thereby protecting so-called respectable women, virgins and wives, from the word that sound like grape or seduction. So in many places you had licensed brothels, sometimes confined to specific districts, often marked by a red lantern or similar sign. It was a grim attempt to control and contain something society deemed both inevitable and deplorable. Of course, the lives of the women involved were anything but glamorous. They were marginalized, often exploited, faced constant risk of disease and violence, and had very few, if any, other options. A necessary evil for society, perhaps, but a harsh reality for those forced into it. And that brings us to a darker, unavoidable topic: the word grape and sexual violence. This was a grim and brutal reality in the Middle Ages, just as it sadly remains in many societies. It was legally defined as a crime, and penalties could be severe, at least on paper, ranging from fines and mutilation to death. However, actually getting a conviction was incredibly difficult. So much depended on the social status of the victim and the perpetrator. The grape of a virgin noblewoman was treated far more seriously, often because it impacted property rights and lineage, than the grape of a peasant woman, a servant, or, heaven forbid, a prostitute, whose testimony might be dismissed entirely. The onus was often on the woman to prove she had resisted fiercely and cried out for help immediately. Wartime, with its breakdown of social order, was particularly horrific, with grape used as a weapon of terror and domination. It's a stark reminder that beneath the veneer of chivalry and piety, violence against women was a persistent and often unpunished horror. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, from all this transgression, let's not forget the ideals of celibacy and virginity. In a world so focused on the potential sinfulness of sex, choosing not to engage in it was seen as the ultimate power move, spiritually speaking. Virginity, especially for women before marriage, was massively prized, a symbol of purity and family honor. And for those who dedicated their lives to God, monks, nuns, and eventually the clergy as a whole, clerical celibacy became a mandatory rule over centuries, not without a struggle. Celibacy was the gold standard. It was seen as a path to greater spiritual purity, a way to focus entirely on the divine without the messy distractions of earthly desires. Of course, whether everyone in a monastery or nunnery actually stuck to this is a whole other can of worms, as Chaucer and Boccaccio gleefully pointed out. But the ideal was incredibly powerful. Now, we've talked a lot about heterosexual relationships, whether sanctioned or sinful. But what about people whose desires and identities didn't fit that mold? The Middle Ages weren't a blank slate when it came to same-sex attraction or individuals who defied gender norms. However, the official response was, to put it mildly, not exactly welcoming. In fact, it was often downright terrifying. The dominant term you'll encounter in medieval texts when discussing same-sex acts, particularly between men, is sodomy. This was a catch-all term, often vaguely defined but heavily associated with the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah. It could encompass a range of non-procreative sexual acts, not just homosexual ones, but it became the primary label for condemning male same-sex intimacy. And the condemnation was severe. The church, and subsequently secular laws inspired by it, viewed sodomy as one of the most heinous sins, an unnatural act that cried out to heaven for vengeance. Think fire, brimstone, and eternal damnation kind of serious. The penalties prescribed in legal codes across Europe could be horrific: castration, banishment, imprisonment, and very often, death by burning. This wasn't just a theoretical threat. People were prosecuted and executed for sodomy. It's important to note that the concept of homosexuality as an identity, as we understand it today, didn't really exist in the same way. The focus was generally on the act itself being sinful, rather than an inherent orientation. Someone might be accused of committing sodomy, not necessarily labeled a sodomite in the sense of a fixed identity, though repeated accusations could certainly lead to that kind of social branding and persecution. Given this incredibly hostile environment, how do we even know same-sex desire existed? Well, ironically, much of our evidence comes from the very records of condemnation. Court documents detailing accusations and trials, those ever-present penitentials listing penances for same-sex acts, and theological tracts warning against it. They all inadvertently testify to its presence. If nobody was doing it, why spend so much time and energy forbidding it? Beyond the condemnations, there are glimpses in literature and poetry, sometimes veiled, sometimes surprisingly frank, depending on the period and region. We also see it in accusations leveled against groups, like the Knights Templar, where charges of sodomy were part of a wider political takedown. There are also records of passionate friendships between men, particularly in monastic settings, that sometimes use romantic language. Now, interpreting these historical expressions of affection is complex. Not all intense same-sex friendships were sexual, of course, but it's clear that deep emotional and, for some, physical bonds between men existed, forced into the deepest shadows by societal and religious terror. What about women? Female same-sex desire is even more obscured in the historical record, largely because medieval society was so male-centric. Women's sexuality in general was often seen primarily in relation to men, for procreation or male pleasure. Because female same-sex acts didn't involve the spilling of seed, a major theological concern in male sodomy, and couldn't result in pregnancy, they were sometimes considered less of a threat, or simply less visible. However, they were acknowledged and condemned in some penitentials and legal texts, sometimes referred to as tribadism, or unnatural acts between women, with penances prescribed. Again, evidence is sparse and often indirect. Warnings in religious texts, mentions in court cases, or occasionally in literature. As for gender nonconformity, individuals who defied expected gender roles certainly existed. The most famous example is probably Joan of Arc, whose insistence on wearing male attire was a significant factor in her trial and condemnation for heresy. While Joan's motivations were complex and not necessarily tied to sexual identity as we'd frame it, her story highlights the extreme societal discomfort with those who blurred established gender lines. There are also scattered references to women living as men, or men adopting female roles, often in the context of religious asceticism, or, conversely, accusations of deception or witchcraft. It's crucial to acknowledge these hidden histories. To pretend that same-sex desire or gender variance didn't exist in the Middle Ages simply because they were brutally suppressed would be to erase the experiences of countless individuals. Their lives were lived under immense pressure and danger, but their desires, their identities, and their struggles are part of the full, complex tapestry of medieval life. Understanding this suppression also tells us a lot about the anxieties and power structures of the time. We've waded through sin, matrimony, secret trysts, and some pretty wild medieval science. So now it's time for a bit of a recap, and, more importantly, some good old-fashioned myth-busting. Because let's be honest, the Middle Ages has more persistent myths than a dragon has scales. First up, chastity belts. Were these ironclad contraptions clamped onto every unwilling maiden and wandering wife? Mostly no. The vast majority of evidence for medieval chastity belts dates from much later periods, often as curiosities, jokes, or even 19th century fabrications. While the idea might have floated around, they weren't exactly standard medieval lingerie, so you can probably unbuckle that particular image from your mind. Myth 2. Everyone was utterly prudish, and sex was never ever discussed or enjoyed. As Chaucer, Boccaccio, and those saucy fabliaux we talked about would gleefully tell you, wrong. The church might have been preaching solemnity, but everyday folks, in their stories, and likely in their lives, had a much earthier and often funnier take on things. The sheer volume of church warnings against enjoying sex too much kind of proves people were, enjoying it. Myth 3. No concept of romantic love. Again, while marriage wasn't always its home, courtly love poetry, and personal letters show that deep affection and passion were definitely a thing. It just often lived in a different neighborhood than the marital home. What's the real takeaway? The Middle Ages weren't a monolith. Saying sex in the Middle Ages was X is like saying today is Y. It hugely varied. We're talking about 1,000 years, from the early, so-called Dark Ages to the vibrant High Middle Ages and the cusp of the Renaissance. Attitudes and practices changed dramatically over that time. Then there are regional differences. What was happening in sunny Italy might be quite different from chilly Scandinavia or bustling Paris. And, crucially, social class. A noblewoman's experience of sex and marriage was worlds away from a peasant farmer's or a city artisan's. And perhaps the biggest nuance, the Grand Canyon-sized gap that often existed between doctrine, what the church preached, and practice, what actual fallible human beings got up to. They had rules, sure, but they also had ingenuity. Ultimately, if there's one thing the Middle Ages really hammers home about sex and intimacy, it's that despite all the dogmas, doctrines, and societal pressures, human nature is a remarkably persistent weed. Or maybe a beautiful, resilient wildflower. People sought love, they desired connection, they experienced pleasure, and they navigated complex relationships in ways that are, at their core, surprisingly relatable even centuries later. They were just doing it with less sanitation and more lute music. After diving deep into the medieval world of sex and intimacy, dodging sin, navigating marriage contracts, and peeking into some surprisingly racy literature, what was it really like? Well, if you were expecting a simple answer, you clearly haven't been paying attention to history. It was a glorious, messy contradiction. Imagine a rule book written by the sternest librarian you know, but the partygoers are constantly finding hilarious loopholes. It was defined by incredibly strict religious doctrine, yet absolutely fizzing with human passion. Marriage was often a business deal, but genuine love still found ways to sneak in, like a charming rogue at a royal banquet. Pleasure was officially suspect, yet people clearly went to great lengths to find it, proving that some things just never change, not even with a threat of eternal damnation or a really uncomfortable penitential exercise. What medieval revelation surprised you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this historical unmasking, please like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you don't miss our next adventure into the past. Thanks for watching.